So boys, today we're going to talk about induced immunity. So that's our last section on our body's defense against disease. And we've already spoken about induced immunity anyway, because all it means is that the body is making antibodies to fight the infection. So if you remember from yesterday's class and poor old Mary, as she was being attacked by COVID-19, we have spoken about her actually having induced immunity all day yesterday. We said that when COVID-19 came into the body, her third line of defense was to actually make antibodies. And we looked at the idea that a cell that was going to make antibodies for her was the lymphocyte. And then we pushed it even further and we said, you know what, we can call this lymphocyte by a more technical name. So we said a B lymphocyte or a B cell was the cell that was going to make the antibodies, and we had our little chef Lego men doing that for us. And if we recap what an antibody actually was, we said it was a defense protein produced by the B cells. And we said, why does it actually make the antibody first of all? And that's because it came across viruses that had chemicals on the outside that showed our body they should not be in our body. And we called those chemicals antigens. So thank God viruses or bacteria or fungi, stuff or pathogens our body does not make, that they actually have antigens. And we broke that word up into anti for antibody and gen for generator. So we said an antigen was an antibody generator, whereas the antibody was the actual protein the B cells were making. So we've covered already what induced immunity actually is. So it's using antibodies to fight infection. So induced immunity is using antibodies to fight infection. So boys, just like we mentioned a few minutes ago, so induced immunity is the use of antibodies to fight infection. Now, we can really use antibodies in two ways. The case that we looked at yesterday with Mary, she was actually making her own antibodies. So we would say that in Mary's case, it was active induced immunity. She was making her own antibodies. So there is another version of immunity where you mightn't get to make your own antibodies. So say for the disease tetanus, you mightn't have a chance, so there mightn't be time to make the antibodies, or there mightn't be a vaccination ready that you could make the antibodies by putting a dead dose of a virus into you. We'll mention in a moment. Sometimes it can actually be passive. So somebody can give you an injection of the antibodies and you don't make them yourself. It's still induced immunity because you're using antibodies, but in active immunity, you make it yourself. And in passive immunity, another organism gives you their antibodies. Very topical at the moment, talking about maybe getting antibodies eventually. They're mentioning serology, which has to do with blood and serum of blood and taking antibodies out of people that have already had COVID-19 and giving it to people that haven't had it to protect them straight away from the disease. So we'll talk about that in a moment again. So boys, we're mentioning there again, so just reviewing the idea that induced immunity is making antibodies, and active, the organism makes its own antibodies, just like Mary did yesterday in our video. And in passive, the organism does not produce the antibodies. So the organism receives them from another organism that has made them. And I suppose there's two versions of that. So one of the versions would be that you can receive them naturally. So we call it natural passive immunity. An example of that might be, I know we haven't studied reproduction yet, but it might be the idea that an organism could get it from its mother. So it might get it from its mother in breast milk. So we would speak later maybe of colostrum, the type of breast milk that's kind of available from the mom in the first 2 to 3 days when the baby is born. So people would be really encouraged to breastfeed for at least 2 or 3 days because the milk is full of antibodies and it's called colostrum. So the baby didn't make the antibodies itself, it gets it directly from its mom. And also the idea that antibodies will pass through the placenta. So we would have mentioned placenta at junior cert. So the baby's not making the antibodies again. The mom is giving it to the baby. Okay. Our other version then might be the idea that it might be artificially given, just like the example that I told you already. So the idea that you might just get an injection of antibodies. So our example of that would be something like a tetanus shot. And the idea that it's temporary, it's short lasting. It's about 10 years now when they give you antibodies. It used to be only about 3, but it's about 10 years now when you get a tetanus injection. So you just get an injection of the antibodies. So it is temporary, it's short-lived. So boys, a quick review. So the idea that induced immunity, the use of antibodies can be passive. The organism does not make the antibodies, it receives it from another organism. You have 2 types of passive immunity. It can be natural, where the mom just gives an example, the mom giving the antibodies to the baby via breast milk or through the placenta in the earlier times when it's in the mom's womb. Or artificial, where you can get an injection of the antibodies. But both are short-lived. That baby will only have the antibodies as long as the mom is feeding it. So it's short-lived. It's not for life. And then boys, we also mentioned active. So it's induced immunity again. It's using antibodies, but the organism is producing its own antibodies. So our 2 examples again, once again, we're talking about natural. So that would be the case where we would get maybe the flu or COVID-19 or chickenpox ourselves. So next to natural, I'm just going to put example Mary from us discussing Mary getting the COVID-19 yesterday. So the idea that you get the pathogen, or the pathogen invades your body. I'm just going to put that lovely word we're all sick of listening to, COVID-19, and you make the antibodies yourself. And my other version of that will be the artificial. And my example of that will be if you got a vaccination. So this is what we're really hoping, and they're talking about 12 months, hopefully even less, that they will have a vaccination for COVID-19. So it's often a dead dose or a very small dose of the virus. So sometimes it could be just the coat of the virus with the antigen in it. That's all we want. Goes into the body, and the body then makes antibodies. And you're kind of safe because the virus can't replicate or multiply, but your body's still reacting to those antigens on the outside that we've spoken so much about. And both of these, so they're permanent. So I'm going to put the word that it's longer lasting. So the idea that you don't get the virus again. So we're going back to the idea of the memory, B cells and T cells hanging out there throughout your life. So it's permanent, it's long lasting, it's long lived. Whereas passive was short lived. You get a dose of the antibodies into your body, but you don't make them yourself. So boys, very quick review. Induced immunity, what should I know? It's immunity that uses antibodies. You have 2 choices. You can make them yourself, which is called active, or you can get them put into your body by a different organism, receive them and not make them at all. It's called passive. You have 2 types of active. Natural is where you get the infection, you make your own antibodies, and artificial where you might get a vaccination and that your body then has to make its own antibodies as well. So active is making antibodies and it's permanent. It's for your whole life. And then passive, you don't make the antibodies, you might receive them from another organism. Example, from your mom, it might be natural immunity, where you get it in the breast milk or through the placenta, and then artificial, maybe you get an injection of those antibodies, but it's short-lived, you haven't made the antibodies yourself. This might happen if they don't have a vaccination already, or very quickly you need the injection, or it might be too expensive to make the vaccination as well. So they're the different options. So I'll post a quiz up on Office 365 and I'll post a picture of your notes as well to continue.